Mrs. Davidson, with all due respect, you should leave the serious matters to those who understand them. City Council Chairman Vincent Carrera's dismissive tone echoed through the packed conference room at Phoenix City Hall. His weathered face showed barely concealed contempt as he addressed the woman sitting quietly in the front row. These zoning decisions affect real businesses, real livelihoods. This isn't some charity auction you can organize with your lady friends. The room erupted in polite but nervous laughter. Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, though none dared challenge Carrera's authority. He had controlled Phoenix's most lucrative development deals for over a decade, and his influence extended far beyond the official chambers. Elena Davidson sat motionless, her manicured hands folded neatly in her lap. At 42, she embodied the image of the perfect political wife, elegant, well-dressed, and seemingly content to smile graciously while more important people discussed serious matters. Her auburn hair was styled in a conservative bob, her navy blue dress both professional and unthreatening. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything more than Mayor Richard Davidson's attractive, supportive spouse. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Carrera," she replied softly, her voice barely carrying to the back of the room. "I'm simply asking why the environmental impact study was never completed before approving the Riverside Plaza project." Carrera's eyes narrowed. The $200 million development had been his pet project for 3 years, promising to transform a section of Phoenix's riverfront into luxury condominiums and high-end retail. What he hadn't expected was scrutiny from the mayor's wife, especially about details buried deep in bureaucratic paperwork. "The study was deemed unnecessary by our environmental consultants," he said curtly. "We have experts who handle these technical matters. Perhaps you should focus on the hospital fundraising gala next month. I'm sure the ladies' auxiliary could use your attention." More uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd. Elena's cheeks flushed slightly, but her expression remained composed. She gathered her papers quietly and stood to leave, offering a polite nod to the council before walking toward the exit. Several attendees whispered among themselves as she passed, some with sympathy, others with amusement at her public dismissal. What none of them knew was that Elena Davidson had spent the previous 3 months conducting her own investigation into Carrera's business dealings. What they couldn't see beneath her carefully maintained exterior was 15 years of experience in corporate intelligence, skills honed at one of Washington, D.C.'s most exclusive consulting firms, before she'd given up that life to support her husband's political career. And what Vincent Carrera had no way of knowing was that his casual dismissal had just made Elena's decision for her. The gloves were coming off. Elena's background, Elena Maria Vasquez, had grown up in a modest 2-bedroom house in Tucson, the daughter of a high school mathematics teacher and a nurse. Her parents, both first-generation Mexican-Americans, had instilled in her the values of education, hard work, and quiet determination. While her classmates focused on social activities and weekend parties, Elena spent her free time in the library, devouring books on history, politics, and international relations. Her academic excellence earned her a full scholarship to Georgetown University, where she double-majored in international affairs and economics. It was there, during her junior year, that she was quietly recruited by Meridian Strategic Solutions, a boutique consulting firm that specialized in what they euphemistically called information architecture for Fortune 500 companies and select government agencies. Meridian's work existed in the gray areas between legal corporate research and industrial espionage. Their clients needed to know what their competitors were planning, what regulatory changes might affect their industries, and which government officials might be susceptible to influence. Elena's combination of analytical intelligence, language, skills, and unassuming appearance made her an ideal candidate for their most sensitive assignments. For the first 5 years after graduation, Elena lived a double life that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her socially. By day, she attended Georgetown Law School part-time, maintaining the appearance of a serious but unremarkable graduate student. By night and on weekends, she conducted surveillance operations, gathered intelligence at corporate functions, and analyzed financial documents that revealed patterns of corruption and influence peddling across multiple industries. Her specialty became what Meridian called social infiltration, using her natural ability to appear harmless and slightly naive, to gain access to information that more obvious operatives could never obtain. Corporate executives and government officials would speak freely around her, assuming she lacked the knowledge or interest to understand the implications of what they were discussing. Elena's breakthrough case came during her 4th year with Meridian, when she successfully exposed a conspiracy involving 3 defense contractors and a Pentagon procurement officer. The investigation required her to spend 6 months posing as a legislative aide while building relationships with key figures in the conspiracy. Her evidence led to federal indictments and saved taxpayers over $400 million in fraudulent contracts. Success brought her to the attention of Meridian's most exclusive clients, and for the next decade, she operated at the highest levels of corporate and political intelligence. She investigated corruption in pharmaceutical companies, exposed insider trading schemes involving federal regulators, and uncovered foreign influence operations targeting American energy companies. Throughout this period, Elena maintained her cover identity as a graduate student and later as a junior associate at a prestigious law firm. Only a handful of people knew about her real profession, and she went to extraordinary lengths to keep her 2 worlds separate. She lived modestly, drove an unremarkable car, and cultivated an image of quiet competence rather than the sophisticated expertise she actually possessed. Meeting Richard, Elena's life changed unexpectedly at a Georgetown alumni reception in 2008. She had attended reluctantly, viewing such social functions as necessary but tedious obligations. Her cover identity required her to maintain appropriate professional relationships, though she rarely enjoyed the small talk and superficial networking that such events demanded. She was standing near the refreshment table, politely listening to a law firm partner describe his latest golf vacation when she noticed a man across the room who seemed as uncomfortable with the social dynamics as she felt. Richard Davidson stood slightly apart from the main conversations, his posture suggesting he was present out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. At 35, Richard possessed the earnest idealism that Elena had long since learned to view with professional skepticism. He was recently elected to the Arizona state legislature, having campaigned on a platform of government transparency and ethical reform. His background as a public school teacher and coach gave him an authenticity that was rare in political circles. Though Elena initially wondered how long such principles would survive contact with real political pressure, their conversation began with the usual pleasantries, but Elena found herself genuinely engaged as Richard described his frustration with the influence of special interests in state politics. He spoke passionately about his efforts to reform campaign finance laws and increase public access to government decision-making processes. "The problem isn't that politicians are inherently corrupt," he said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who still believed in the possibility of genuine reform. "It's that the system makes it almost impossible to serve the public interest. When you're constantly worried about fundraising and political survival." Elena listened with growing interest, recognizing in Richard's idealism both an opportunity and a potential problem. His commitment to transparency was admirable, but also dangerous in a political environment where powerful interests operated most effectively in the shadows. She found herself genuinely attracted to his principles while simultaneously calculating. how vulnerable those same principles made him to more sophisticated operators. Over the following months, their relationship developed with surprising naturalness. Richard was unlike the men Elena typically encountered in her professional life, politicians and corporate executives who measured every word for its strategic impact. He spoke directly, listened carefully, and seemed genuinely interested in her opinions rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. Elena faced an unprecedented dilemma. For the first time in her adult life, she had met someone she genuinely cared about, but her feelings existed within the context of a carefully constructed false identity. Richard knew her as Elena Vasquez, a law firm associate with an interest in public policy. He had no idea that she spent most of her time conducting covert investigations into exactly the kind of corruption he was trying to combat. The situation became more complicated when Richard asked her to marry him during a quiet dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Potomac. His proposal was characteristically direct and heartfelt, accompanied by a simple ring that reflected both his modest public service salary and his genuine affection. "I know this is fast," he said, his usual confidence replaced by nervous vulnerability. "But I've never met anyone who understands what I'm trying to accomplish in politics. You listen to my ideas without rolling your eyes or trying to change the subject. You ask the right questions, the ones that make me think deeper about the issues I'm working on." Elena felt a moment of panic as she realized how carefully she had managed their conversations, using her professional skills to appear supportive, while gathering information about his political activities and potential vulnerabilities. The techniques that made her an effective intelligence operative had also made her the perfect political partner, though not in the way Richard imagined. After 3 sleepless nights of consideration, Elena made a decision that surprised her Meridian handlers and changed the trajectory of her life. She would marry Richard Davidson and retire from active intelligence work, transitioning to the role of political spouse while keeping her professional skills in reserve. The transition leaving Meridian proved more complicated than Elena had anticipated. Her handlers expressed concern about operational security, worrying that her marriage to an increasingly prominent politician might compromise ongoing investigations. They offered her alternatives: assignments that would keep her closer to Washington, covers that would be compatible with political life, even the possibility of using Richard's career as a platform for more sophisticated influence operations. Elena rejected all such suggestions. Her decision to marry Richard was also a decision to step away from the moral ambiguities that had defined her professional life. She wanted to support his idealistic efforts at reform, to be genuinely helpful to his career rather than simply using their relationship for intelligence purposes. The psychological adjustment proved more difficult than she had expected. After 15 years of analyzing everyone she met for potential exploitation, Elena struggled to interact with people as simply Elena Davidson, rather than as an operative evaluating targets and opportunities. She found herself automatically cataloging the weaknesses and motivations of Richard's political colleagues, then forcing herself to stop such analysis. Richard's 2012 campaign for Phoenix mayor provided Elena with her first real test of her new identity. She threw herself into the traditional role of candidate spouse, organizing fundraising events, speaking to community groups, and presenting the image of supportive femininity that voters seemed to expect from political wives. The campaign's success surprised political observers who had expected Richard's reformist message to struggle against more established candidates with deeper financial backing. Elena's social skills, which she had developed for very different purposes, proved invaluable in building the relationships and coalitions that carried Richard to an unexpected victory. As mayor's wife, Elena settled into a routine that appeared to satisfy everyone's expectations while leaving her feeling increasingly restless. She organized charity events, supported local arts organizations, and served on the boards of several non-profit groups. Her public image crystallized around the notion of the devoted political wife who preferred supporting roles to seeking attention for herself. Privately, Elena struggled with the intellectual and professional emptiness of her new life. The skills that had once made her one of Meridian's most valuable operatives now seemed wasted on organizing hospital fundraisers and attending ribbon-cutting ceremonies. She loved Richard deeply and believed in his political mission, but she felt increasingly disconnected from her own capabilities and sense of purpose. The first signs of trouble, Elena's first indication that something was seriously wrong in Phoenix's city government, came not through any sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation, but through the casual comments of other political wives at a charity luncheon. "Richard is so idealistic," commented Margaret Winters, wife of longtime city councilman David Winters. "It's refreshing, though I wonder how long it will last once he understands how things really work around here." Elena smiled politely and asked what Margaret meant, though her professional instincts had already begun to activate. The response was a knowing look exchanged between Margaret and two other women at the table. "Oh, you know," Margaret said with practiced vagueness. "The way business gets done in any city, compromises, understandings, the relationships that make things happen. Richard will figure it out eventually." Similar conversations occurred over the following weeks, always featuring the same combination of knowing smiles and careful non-specificity. Elena found herself paying closer attention to the dynamics at city functions, noting which business leaders seemed to have privileged access to certain council members, and which development projects moved through the approval process with surprising speed. Her curiosity became concern when Richard mentioned his growing frustration with City Council Chairman Vincent Carrera during one of their private dinners at home. "He's blocking everything," Richard said, pushing food around his plate with uncharacteristic agitation. "Infrastructure repairs, public transit improvements, anything that might require raising taxes or challenging existing arrangements. It's like he has some kind of veto power over city policy." Elena asked careful questions, drawing on her old professional habits while maintaining the appearance of simple spousal interest. She learned that Carrera had served on the city council for 12 years, during which time he had built relationships with every major development company in Phoenix. His construction company, Carrera and Associates, had somehow avoided the recession that devastated most of the local building industry. "The strangest thing," Richard continued, "is how much influence he has with members who should be voting independently. It's like there's some kind of coordination happening that I'm not seeing." Elena nodded sympathetically, though her mind was already beginning to organize the information into patterns that suggested something more systematic than simple political disagreement. Her husband's frustration was being caused by what intelligence professionals called a captured system, a government structure that appeared to function normally while actually serving the interests of a small group of connected individuals. The environmental study, Elena's decision to attend the city council meeting, where Carrera dismissed her so publicly, had been carefully calculated, though not in the way anyone present might have imagined. Over the previous month, she had conducted her own preliminary investigation into the Riverside Plaza project, using techniques that were rusty from disuse but still effective. The environmental impact study she had mentioned was indeed missing, but that was only the most visible symptom of a much larger problem. Elena had spent 3 weeks analyzing public records, tracking property transactions, and mapping the relationships between various business entities involved in the development. What she had discovered was a sophisticated system of influence, and profit-sharing that connected Carrera, several other council members, and at least 6 major development companies. The Riverside Plaza project was just one element in a larger scheme that had generated millions in profits while systematically undermining the city's environmental protections and public oversight processes. Elena's questions at the council meeting had been designed to gauge Carrera's awareness that someone was investigating his operations. His dismissive response told her that he viewed her as nothing more than an annoying distraction, which meant he had no idea that his activities were under professional scrutiny. That miscalculation was about to become very expensive for Vincent Carrera and his associates. The decision that evening, Elena sat in her study reviewing the files she had compiled on Carrera's network. For the first time in nearly a decade, she felt the familiar excitement of a complex investigation beginning to take shape. The evidence she had gathered so far was suggestive but not conclusive, enough to confirm that serious corruption was occurring, but not enough to prove it in a way that would lead to successful prosecutions. Richard was in his office across the hall, working late on a budget proposal that would probably be blocked by Carrera's coalition, regardless of its merits. Her husband's frustration was palpable, and Elena could see that his idealism was beginning to erode under the constant pressure of systematic obstruction. She had a choice to make. She could continue playing the role of supportive political wife, focusing on charity work and social functions while watching her husband's reform agenda slowly die. Or she could dust off skills she had thought were permanently retired and take on Vincent Carrera using methods he would never see coming. The decision crystallized as she thought about Carrera's condescending dismissal earlier that day. He had made the same mistake that had doomed targets throughout her intelligence career. He had underestimated the quiet woman in the background, assuming that her unassuming appearance reflected a lack of capability rather than a carefully cultivated cover identity. Elena opened her laptop and began drafting an encrypted message to her former handler at Meridian. After 5 years of retirement, she was ready to go back to work. But this time, she would be working for herself, for her husband, and for a city that deserved better than the corruption that Vincent Carrera had built into its foundations. This time, the stakes were personal. The perfect political wife was about to disappear, replaced by something Vincent Carrera had never encountered and was completely unprepared to handle. Elena Davidson was going to infiltrate the enemy's stronghold, and she was going to do it so skillfully that her targets wouldn't realize what was happening until it was far too late. The transformation was about to begin, and Phoenix's most powerful political operator had no idea that his greatest threat was sitting quietly in a study just 3 miles away, planning his downfall with the methodical precision of a professional who had never failed to bring down her targets. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. Mrs. Davidson, with all due respect, you should leave the serious matters to those who understand them. City Council Chairman Vincent Carrera's dismissive tone echoed through the packed conference room at Phoenix City Hall. His weathered face showed barely concealed contempt as he addressed the woman sitting quietly in the front row. Elena Davidson sat motionless, her manicured hands folded neatly in her lap. At 42, she embodied the image of the perfect political wife, elegant, well-dressed, and seemingly content to smile graciously while more important people discussed serious matters. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything more than Mayor Richard Davidson's attractive, supportive spouse. What Vincent Carrera had no way of knowing was that his casual dismissal had just activated someone with 15 years of experience in corporate intelligence, skills honed at one of Washington, D.C.'s most exclusive consulting firms. Elena Davidson was about to dust off abilities that could expose corruption at the highest levels. The investigation begins. 3 days after her public humiliation, Elena sat in a downtown coffee shop, her laptop displaying financial records that told a story of systematic corruption. Her former contacts at Meridian Strategic Solutions had provided access to databases that revealed the true scope of Carrera's network. The Riverside Plaza project was just the tip of the iceberg. Over the past 5 years, Carrera had orchestrated a scheme involving shell companies, inflated contracts, and kickbacks that had funneled over $50 million from city coffers into private accounts. The environmental study she'd asked about wasn't missing by accident. It would have revealed contamination that made the development site worthless. Elena's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Parking garage, level 3, 2 p.m. Come alone. The source at exactly 2 p.m., Elena found herself face-to-face with Maria Santos, a mid-level accountant in the city planning department. The woman's hands shook as she handed Elena a thick envelope. "I've been trying to find someone to give this to for months," Maria whispered. "When I saw you challenge Carrera at the meeting, I knew you were the one." The envelope contained copies of invoices, bank transfers, and meeting notes that documented the corruption network in devastating detail. Carrera wasn't working alone. 3 other council members, the planning director, and at least 8 business owners were involved in the scheme. "They think I'm just a bookkeeper who doesn't understand what I'm seeing," Maria continued. "But I've been documenting everything. The problem is, if I go to the authorities directly, they'll destroy me. I need someone with protection, someone they can't easily dismiss." Elena studied the documents, her trained eye immediately recognizing the patterns of organized corruption. "Maria, this is enough evidence to bring down the entire network. But we need more than documents. We need recorded conversations, proof of the money trail. How do we get that?" Elena smiled for the first time in weeks. "Leave that to me." The infiltration, Elena's plan, required her to do something she'd avoided for 5 years, return to active fieldwork. But this time, she had an advantage her old targets had never provided. She was already inside the social circle. She began with Margaret Winters, the councilman's wife, who had made those knowing comments at the charity luncheon. Elena invited her to lunch at Phoenix's most exclusive country club, a setting where Margaret would feel comfortable and superior. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Elena said over champagne and salmon, "about how Richard needs to understand how things really work. Maybe you could help me understand so I can guide him better." Margaret's eyes lit up. She had been waiting for this conversation, the moment when the idealistic mayor's wife would finally acknowledge political reality. "It's really quite simple," Margaret explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Certain projects get priority because they benefit the right people. Vincent has spent years building relationships, creating opportunities for everyone to prosper. Your husband's reform agenda threatens that balance." Over the next 2 hours, Margaret revealed details about weekly meetings at Carrera's private club, coded language used in official communications, and the system of financial incentives that kept council members loyal. Elena listened with apparent fascination while recording every word through a device disguised as an elegant brooch. The private club, getting access to Carrera's inner circle, required a more sophisticated approach. Elena learned that the weekly meetings took place at the Pinnacle Club, an exclusive establishment where Phoenix's power brokers conducted business away from public scrutiny. Elena's solution was elegantly simple. She volunteered to coordinate the annual charity auction for Phoenix Children's Hospital, positioning herself as someone who needed to cultivate relationships with the city's wealthiest donors. Her role gave her legitimate reasons to approach Carrera and his associates. "Mr. Carrera," she said at a city function, her manner perfectly calibrated to suggest respectful deference. "I apologize for any misunderstanding at the council meeting. I'm hoping we can work together on the hospital fundraiser. Your business connections would be invaluable." Carrera studied her carefully, looking for signs of the woman who had challenged him publicly. What he saw was exactly what Elena wanted him to see: a chastened political wife who had learned her place. "Mrs. Davidson, I appreciate your mature approach to this situation. Perhaps we can find ways to work together that benefit everyone involved." Within 2 weeks, Elena had secured an invitation to the Pinnacle Club's donor appreciation dinner. She arrived in an elegant black dress, her demeanor perfectly matching the expectations of wealthy men who preferred women to be beautiful, agreeable, and uninterested in their business discussions. The recording. The dinner proceeded exactly as Elena had predicted. After the formal presentations, the real business began in small groups scattered around the club's private rooms. Elena positioned herself near Carrera's table, apparently engrossed, in conversation with other spouses, while actually documenting every word of the corrupt official's planning session. "The Morrison development is next," Carrera was saying to Planning Director James Webb. "Same structure as Riverside. City buys the land at premium prices. We handle the development through the usual channels. Everyone gets their cut." Webb nodded, consulting notes on his phone. "Environmental assessment will take 6 months if we do it properly. 2 weeks if we use Blackstone Environmental. They understand the requirements." Elena's recording device captured 45 minutes of detailed planning for multiple fraudulent projects. She had enough evidence to destroy Carrera's network, but she needed one final piece: proof of the money trail. The financial evidence Elena's breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Richard mentioned during dinner that the city was switching banks for municipal accounts, a decision that had been made suddenly by the city council despite higher fees with the new institution. "Which bank?" Elena asked casually. "Southwest Commerce Bank. Strange choice, they're not even local." Vincent pushed it through over the city manager's objections. That night, Elena used her Meridian contacts to investigate Southwest Commerce Bank. What she discovered was a financial institution that specialized in complex transactions for clients who valued discretion over transparency. The bank's ownership structure included shell companies connected to several members of Carrera's network. Using techniques she hadn't employed in years, Elena gained access to preliminary financial records that showed the flow of city funds through accounts controlled by Carrera's associates. The money trail was clear. Inflated city contracts generated excess payments that were routed through Southwest Commerce Bank to personal accounts belonging to the conspiracy members. Elena now had everything she needed: recorded conversations, documentary evidence, and financial proof of the corruption scheme. But she faced a final challenge: how to expose the network without revealing her own intelligence background or compromising Maria Santos. The exposure Elena's solution demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made her Meridian's most successful operative. Rather than going directly to law enforcement, she orchestrated a revelation that would appear to come from multiple independent sources. She began by providing selected evidence to investigative reporter Jennifer Martinez at the Phoenix Tribune, presenting herself as a concerned citizen who had stumbled across suspicious documents. The story that emerged focused on irregularities in city contracting processes, with Elena positioned as a civic-minded mayor's wife who had asked innocent questions that revealed larger problems. Simultaneously, Elena arranged for Maria Santos to provide her financial evidence to the FBI's white-collar crime unit, with Elena serving as a corroborating witness rather than the primary source. The third element of her strategy was the most personal. At the next city council meeting, Elena rose during public comment period to play selected recordings of Carrera's conversations at the Pinnacle Club. "I believe the citizens of Phoenix have a right to hear how their elected officials discuss public business in private," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence that had fallen over the chamber. Carrera's face went white as his own voice filled the room, discussing kickbacks and fraudulent environmental assessments with casual indifference to public welfare. The aftermath. The revelation of the corruption network created a political earthquake that reverberated far beyond Phoenix. Within 48 hours, the FBI had launched a formal investigation. The state attorney general had announced plans for independent oversight of city contracts, and 3 council members had resigned rather than face questioning about their involvement. Vincent Carrera was arrested at his home 2 weeks later, charged with conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The evidence Elena had gathered, combined with Maria Santos's financial documentation, provided prosecutors with an airtight case that led to a plea agreement requiring Carrera to provide testimony against his co-conspirators. The Resolution 6. Months later, Elena stood in her kitchen reading the morning paper's coverage of the final corruption trial. 11 defendants had been convicted. Over $50 million in stolen funds had been recovered, and Phoenix had implemented new transparency measures for all city contracts. Richard found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she finished the article. "You know," he said, "I never did understand how you managed to uncover all that evidence. Your questions at that council meeting were remarkably well informed for someone who supposedly didn't understand city government." Elena leaned back against him, smiling at his reflection in the kitchen window. "Maybe I'm just a very good listener. Or maybe," Richard said, his voice carrying a note of amused suspicion, "there's more to my wife than meets the eye." Elena turned in his arms, her expression perfectly innocent. "Whatever gave you that idea?" But her eyes held a glint that suggested Elena Davidson's most important secret was still safely hidden, ready to be deployed whenever her city, or her family, needed protection that only she could provide. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who appear completely harmless. In Phoenix, one corrupt politician learned that lesson the hard way, discovering too late that the mayor's helpless wife was actually the most formidable opponent he'd ever faced.